Hey everyone, welcome to Dreamwoven History. Today we're beginning a new journey together. In our last story, we walked with dinosaurs, saw their rise, their glory, and finally their fall. 66 million years ago, their age came to an end. But history didn't stop there, because after the thunder of dinosaurs faded, another chapter began. This time, it wasn't reptiles who would rule the land. It was mammals, small, warm-blooded survivors who slowly grew, spread, and adapted to a changing Earth. And among these mammals, one lineage rose higher than most, a lineage that gave us some of the largest land animals to ever walk the planet. Animals of wisdom, animals of memory, animals of immense power and gentle grace. Yes, today we will follow the story of the elephants. Not just the ones we know now, but their ancient ancestors, creatures stranger, larger, and sometimes more fearsome than anything alive today. So let's go back to the world after the dinosaurs and begin the journey of the giants.
66 million years ago, the last thunder of the dinosaurs faded into silence. The skies that once echoed with the cries of pterosaurs now fell still. The Earth was recovering from fire, from darkness, from the strike of a great asteroid that ended an age. Yet, in the ashes of that devastation, a new story was waiting to be told. A story not of reptiles, but of small, warm-blooded creatures that had lived in the shadows while the dinosaurs ruled. They were timid, they were fragile, but they carried within them the seeds of survival. And among these survivors, hidden in the undergrowth, were the first ancestors of what would one day become the giants we know today, the elephants. The age of dinosaurs had ended suddenly. The vast herds of sauropods no longer roamed the plains. No tyrannosaurs stalked the river valleys. For the first time in 160 million years, the land belonged not to the great reptiles, but to the mammals. They were small, no larger than a rabbit, a badger, or a fox. But without dinosaurs above them, they began to spread into empty niches. And slowly, generation by generation, they grew. From tiny insect eaters to hunters to grazers, life was filling the silence left behind. The climate was restless. At times, the world was warmer than today, with lush forests stretching from pole to pole. At other times, it cooled, and ice crept across the land. Each change reshaped the destiny of the mammals. Those who adapted thrived, those who could not vanished. And deep within these changes, a new group of animals began to emerge. They were hoofed mammals, the ungulates, ancestors of horses, of deer, of cattle. And within their story, another branch was beginning, one that would lead, step by step, to the elephants. Somewhere in Africa, about 60 million years ago, a small creature appeared. It did not look like an elephant. It was closer to the size of a pig, with stubby legs and no trunk to speak of. Yet in its teeth, in its jaw, in the faint hints of its bones, paleontologists see the first sparks of what was to come. This was an ancestor of the Proboscidea, the family of trunk bearers. It was not yet a giant, it was not yet majestic, but it was the first step toward the mighty lineage of elephants, mastodons, and mammoths. Why did these creatures grow larger? The answer lies in survival. Large bodies meant safety from predators. They meant strength to move farther in search of food, and they meant stomachs that could digest tough plants that smaller animals could not. Nature was shaping them slowly. From tiny insect eaters to hunters to grazers, life was filling the silence left behind. As time passed, these early ancestors began to live not alone, but together. Small herds formed. Mothers moved with calves. Young ones learned to follow, to feed, to survive as a family. And in these bonds, something important was born: the social memory of elephants. A memory that would echo down millions of years, from the first small herds to the great migrations of mammoths to the elephants that walk among us today. By the end of this time, Earth was ready. The planet was greener, filled with forests, rivers, and open plains. Predators were rising. Competition was fierce. And in Africa, the first true proboscidans, the ancestors of elephants, were preparing to step fully into the story of life. They were not yet giants, but the world had opened a path for them, a path that would, in time, lead to creatures taller than houses, with tusks like spears, and trunks that could shape their environment. The age of elephants was about to begin.
When the age of dinosaurs ended, the earth fell quiet. The great reptiles were gone, leaving forests, rivers, and plains empty of their thunder. But silence does not last long in nature. Small mammals, once hidden in the shadows of giants, now stepped into the sunlight. Among them were the distant ancestors of elephants. Not yet giants, not yet lords of the savannah, but tiny, shrew-like creatures, survivors with the potential to grow into something magnificent. Around 60 million years ago, in Africa, one of the very first known relatives of elephants appeared, Moeritherium. It was small, barely the size of a rabbit, with no trunk, no tusks, and none of the grandeur we imagine. Yet inside its bones lay the blueprint of greatness. This humble creature marked the dawn of the proboscideans, the family that would one day give rise to elephants. Over the next millions of years, these early elephants began to change. Some grew larger. Some took to the water, living like hippos in swamps and lakes. Moeritherium waddled through river shallows with a short, stubby trunk and tusk-like teeth. It looked nothing like the elephants we know, more like a cross between a tapir and a hippo. But these experiments in form were only the first steps on a long journey. Africa was the birthplace of elephants. Here, for tens of millions of years, their ancestors evolved, adapted, and diversified. Some grew tusks, some developed trunks. Each generation brought them closer to the iconic giants we recognize. And Africa would remain their heartland for much of history. One of the greatest inventions in nature was beginning to emerge: the trunk. At first, it was small, clumsy, and awkward. But even this stubby version gave advantages: reaching food, pulling plants, smelling the air. In time, this flexible, muscular nose would become the most versatile tool in the animal kingdom. By 35 million years ago, in Africa, new ancestors like Paleomastodon had grown bigger. They walked on 4 strong legs, bore small tusks, and carried longer trunks. Step by step, the elephant form was assembling. The bones thickened, the skulls widened, the giants were coming. The story of elephants begins not in glory, but in survival. Tiny creatures becoming larger, awkward beasts finding new ways to live. Until at last, the shape of something extraordinary began to emerge. The age of giants was still far ahead, but its roots were already deep in the soil of Africa.
The Miocene epoch, around 20 million years ago. Earth was changing once more. Forests were thinning, grasslands were spreading, and with them came a new challenge: survival in open country. And from the shadows of smaller ancestors, new giants emerged. The Dinosaurs, with downward curved tusks like hooks. The Moeritherium, with 4 tusks, some straight, some shovel-shaped. These weren't just elephants. They were experiments in size, in form, in survival. For the first time since the dinosaurs, the world once again saw animals so massive they reshaped the land they walked upon. Dinotherium was unlike anything alive today. Standing up to 15 feet tall at the shoulder, it rivaled the largest African elephants, but with tusks that curved sharply downward, sprouting not from the upper jaw, but the lower. No one is entirely sure what those tusks were for. Some say they hooked branches, stripping bark from trees. Others believed they dug roots from the ground. What we do know is this: Dinotherium was one of the most successful of its time. For millions of years, it dominated the forests and plains of Africa, Europe, and Asia. And when herds of Dinotheres walked together, they shook the ground with a weight not seen since the last sauropods. If Dinotherium was strange, the Gomphotheres were stranger still. Unlike modern elephants with 2 tusks, many Gomphotheres had 4, 2 above, 2 below. Some tusks curved upward, others were flat and shovel-like. Imagine a giant elephant standing in a marsh, lowering its head and using its shovel tusks like spoons, scooping aquatic plants, slicing through soft soil, dredging up roots. From North America to Asia, Gomphotheres were everywhere. They were explorers, wanderers, pioneers of the elephant family tree. Like modern elephants, these prehistoric giants were social. They moved in herds, led by matriarchs, wise females who guided the group to water, to shelter, to safety. Young calves played, just as they do today, their small trunks learning the language of touch and sound. But life for these giants was never easy. Predators stalked the young, giant hyenas, saber-toothed cats, and packs of dog-like carnivores. And so, as today, mothers and aunts would form a circle around the calves, tusks out, trumpeting into the wind. To live at such size meant constant hunger. Each giant needed hundreds of pounds of food every single day. And so the herds wandered across savannas, through forests, along river valleys. They shaped the land as they moved. Forests thinned under their feeding. Rivers opened as they dug for water. Grasslands spread as seeds passed through their stomachs and sprouted far away. These giants were not just part of the ecosystem, they were its engineers. Not all was peaceful in the Age of Giants. Males, driven by rivalry and the promise of mating rights, clashed in brutal contests. 2 bulls would face each other, trunks raised, tusks clashing. Dust rose as the ground shook beneath their weight. Sometimes the weaker fled. Sometimes the victor won not just the fight, but the future of the herd. These battles echoed across the plains, a thunder not unlike the drums of war. From their African birthplace, the ancestors of elephants marched outward. Dinotheres into Europe and Asia, Gomphotheres into North America, crossing ancient land bridges that no longer exist. For millions of years, they thrived on every continent, except Australia and Antarctica. Wherever they went, they adapted. Forests, swamps, plains, deserts. Their diversity was astonishing. Some small, some colossal. Some with tusks like shovels, others with tusks like swords. The world was theirs. The rise of Dinotheres and Gomphotheres marked the true beginning of elephant greatness. They were not the end of the story, but the first great act. Their bones lie silent now, buried in stone. But in every modern elephant, the sway of the trunk, the wisdom of the herd, the thundering footsteps of giants, echoes the life of those ancient ancestors. The Age of Giants had begun, and it would only grow larger.
The world grew colder. Around 2.6 million years ago, the Ice Age began, its long, relentless grip on Earth. Glaciers crept down from the poles, sculpting valleys, carving mountains, freezing oceans. And in this frozen world, new giants emerged. The mammoths, cloaked in thick fur, with long, spiraling tusks that swept the snow aside. And alongside them, their close cousins, the mastodons, forest dwellers,
heavy and broad, with teeth made for crushing twigs and leaves. For millions of years, these two lineages became the rulers of the Ice Age. One built for the open tundra, the other for the shadowed forest. Together, they were the beating heart of a frozen world. The most famous of all, the woolly mammoth, standing over 10 feet tall with coats of shaggy brown hair and a thick layer of fat beneath their skin. They were living fortresses against the cold. Their tusks curled long and elegant, sometimes over 15 feet in length, used to sweep snow aside, uncovering grasses buried below. Herds moved together across the steppe, endless tundras that stretched from Spain to Siberia, from Alaska to Canada. They were the architects of this frozen ecosystem, grazing vast areas, keeping the land open, shaping the Ice Age plains into the mammoth steppe, one of the richest habitats the Earth has ever known. But not all elephants braved the winds of the tundra. In the great forests of North America, mastodons thrived. They were shorter and stockier than mammoths, with straighter tusks, and their teeth told the story of their world. Broad, blunt molars, perfect for crushing branches, bark, pine cones, and shrubs. Where mammoths ruled the plains, mastodons ruled the woods. For over 20 million years, their lineage endured, one of the most successful in elephant history. Like their ancestors, both mammoths and mastodons lived in herds. Led by wise matriarchs, the groups were bound by memory of feeding grounds, of rivers, of migration routes across hundreds of miles. The young were protected at all costs, and in the coldest nights, herds huddled close, calves sheltered beneath their mothers' heavy bodies, trunks resting on each other like hands in the dark. It was not just survival, it was family. And that bond, strong as ivory, carried them through the long winters. Even giants are not safe from hunger. The Ice Age was home to predators as fearsome as any in history. Saber-toothed cats with fangs like daggers stalked the young. Dire wolves, larger and stronger than modern wolves, hunted in relentless packs. And the short-faced bear, a towering beast faster than a horse, capable of chasing prey across open plains. But to hunt a mammoth or mastodon was to gamble with death. Adults formed walls of tusks in trunks, trumpeting in fury, charging with the weight of 5 tons behind them. For predators, one mistake meant broken bones, and the end. The giants spread across the globe. Mammoths ranged from Africa to Siberia, from the icy tundras of Alaska to the grasslands of Spain. Mastodons made North America their kingdom, from Alaska to Mexico. They adapted to mountains, to swamps, to endless plains. Wherever they went, they shaped the land with their tusks, their feet, their hunger. In some places, mammoths grew smaller, dwarfs on isolated islands, barely the size of ponies. In others, they grew immense. Mammoth steppe, the largest elephants ever to walk the earth, with tusks like twin crescents reaching the sky. And then came us. Early humans first saw mammoths and mastodons as living mountains, beings of awe and danger. We painted them on cave walls, carved them in ivory, sang their names in stories told by firelight. But admiration gave way to survival. With stone-tipped spears and fire, our ancestors hunted them. One mammoth kill could feed a tribe for weeks, provide fur for warmth, bones for shelter, tusks for tools and art. To us, they were both gods and lifelines. For thousands of years, mammoths and mastodons stood as kings of the frozen earth. Their trumpets echoed across icy plains, their shadows stretched across the snow. They were survivors of an age where cold ruled the land. But their reign would not last forever. The ice was changing, and with it the fate of giants would turn. The Ice Age was ending. Around 12,000 years ago, the great glaciers that had ruled for millions of years began to retreat. Ice sheets cracked and broke apart. Rivers burst free, forests spread like green waves across the land. For the mammoths and mastodons, this was a turning point. The frozen plains, once endless pastures of grass, were shrinking. Forests returned, swamps grew, and the land they depended on began to vanish beneath their feet. The giants who had ruled the cold now faced a world that was warming and changing faster than they could adapt. For mammoths, the problem was space. Their steppe, the vast open land that once stretched from Europe to North America, was now breaking into islands of grass. For mastodons, the challenge was survival in forests that grew denser, wetter, and less forgiving. Food became harder to find. The balance that had carried them through millions of years was shifting. And as if the earth itself wasn't enough to challenge them, a new predator had grown stronger than all the rest. Humans had lived alongside mammoths and mastodons for thousands of years. At first, we hunted carefully, a calf here, a weakened bull there. But as our numbers grew, so too did our need. Organized hunts became more common. Tribes learned to drive mammoths into traps, to surround mastodons with fire, to strike together with spears tipped in stone and bone. Each kill brought meat, fur, tools, weapons, and shelter. But each kill also weakened the herds, broke the bond of memory that guided them, and left fewer calves to grow into leaders. And slowly, without knowing it, we pressed the giants toward their end. The signs are written in their bones. Fossils of the last mammoths show tusks with strange growth rings, markers of hunger, of winters with too little food. The teeth of mastodons show cracks, wear, stress, signs of a life harder than ever before. Herds grew smaller, birth rates fell. The once mighty giants of the Ice Age were fading into shadows. The mastodons were the first to fall. In North America, they were hunted and starved into silence around 10,000 years ago. For millions of years, they had been among the most successful of elephants. They had survived warm ages, cold ages, predators, and storms. But against the twin forces of climate change and human hunters, even they could not endure. And with their fall, a chapter of elephant history closed forever. For the mammoths, the story lingered longer. In Siberia, herds survived until about 10,000 years ago. In North America, they held on in patches of tundra, their trumpets echoing across frozen lands. But one by one, their herds vanished. The grasslands they needed were gone, and the hunters never stopped. By the dawn of recorded human history, the mammoth's footsteps had all but disappeared from the continents. But the mammoth story did not end everywhere. On a tiny island in the Arctic Ocean, Wrangel Island, a small herd became trapped, cut off from the mainland. There, in isolation, they survived. Not for hundreds of years, but for thousands. While pyramids rose in Egypt, while humans carved the first cities from stone, mammoths still walked. For 6,000 years after the last mainland herds had vanished, Wrangel Island echoed with the sound of their trunks and tusks. Until finally, just 4,000 years ago, they too were gone. The mammoths had lived long enough to share the earth with humans who wrote, who built, who dreamed. But their time, at last, was over. And so, silence fell. The mastodons, gone. The mammoths, gone save for bones frozen in ice, tusks buried in soil, and the faint traces of their story written in caves and legends. The age of the Ice Age giants had ended, and with them, the Earth grew smaller, quieter, but their memory did not die. In stories, in fossils, in the frozen tundras, the mammoths and mastodons remain. A reminder of giants who once walked beside us, and of how fragile even the greatest can be.
After the rise of mammoths and mastodons, the elephant family still had other branches, strange, powerful cousins who thrived in their own corners of the earth. Among them were the stegodons, sometimes called the roofed-toothed elephants. They appeared in Asia around 11 million years ago and would last until just a few thousand years ago. For most of their reign, they were among the most common large animals in Asia, ruling forests and river valleys. They looked like elephants, yes, but slimmer, longer, with tusks that could stretch nearly 12 feet. They were giants with delicate grace, adapted to the forests instead of the open plains. Stegodons were not rare. In fact, they were everywhere. From India to China, from the islands of Indonesia to the hills of Japan, they spread far and wide. Their herds were enormous, sometimes hundreds moving together through valleys, leaving behind trails that reshaped the land itself. For millions of years, they were the elephants of Asia. To the humans who came much later, it must have seemed as though the forests themselves had giants walking through them. But even stranger than the stegodons were their cousins, the shovel-tuskers. Known as platybelodons and amelodons, they looked like elephants, with a twist. Their lower tusks were flat and wide, shaped like giant shovels. They used them to scoop up soft plants from riverbeds, to strip bark from trees, and to dig for roots in the mud. Imagine a creature as tall as an elephant, but feeding like a gardener with a giant tool built into its jaw. It was bizarre. It was effective. And for millions of years, it worked. These cousins lived side by side with other giants. Saber-toothed cats stalked them. Gigantic rhinos grazed nearby. And early humans watched, learned, and sometimes hunted. The world was crowded with giants then, each one a marvel of adaptation. Stegodons filled the forests, shovel-tuskers filled the wetlands, and for a time, it seemed their reign would never end. But the Earth is never still. About 5 million years ago, the climate began to shift. Wetlands shrank, grasslands spread. The very plants shovel-tuskers depended on began to vanish. Their unique tusks, once so useful, became a trap. They were too specialized, too narrow in their survival. And so, one by one, the shovel-tuskers disappeared from the record of life. A reminder that evolution rewards adaptation, but punishes inflexibility. The stegodons, however, endured. Unlike their shovel-tusker cousins, they could adapt. Some became smaller on islands, evolving into dwarf stegodons, only the size of cows. Others remained massive, giants of the mainland. They lived alongside early humans in Asia, leaving behind bones that were sometimes mistaken for dragons or mythical beasts. Incredibly, stegodons lasted until just 4,000 years ago, making them neighbors, not just to mammoths, but even to ancient civilizations. While humans were building temples and sailing rivers, herds of stegodons still walked in distant forests. But in the end, they too could not survive. The forests they needed shrank. The hunters they feared grew bolder. And like their cousins before them, they faded away. The stegodons were the last of the forgotten cousins, a branch of the elephant family that ruled Asia for millions of years, now reduced to fossils and memory. The story of stegodons and shovel-tuskers reminds us of something simple, yet powerful. That survival is not just about strength. It is about change, flexibility, and timing. The shovel-tuskers could not bend and they broke. The stegodons bent for millions of years, but in the end,
even they were outpaced by change. And so today, the last of the elephants stand alone. But their family was once larger, stranger, and more diverse than most could imagine. The forgotten cousins are gone, yet their story still whispers through the bones left behind in forests, riverbeds, and caves. For millions of years, elephants and their ancestors walked the earth without us. They roamed forests, grasslands, and deserts, never knowing that one day another creature would appear, clever, fragile, and unlike anything they had faced before. That creature was us. Around 2.5 million years ago, the first humans stepped onto the stage of history. And from the very beginning, elephants and humans shared the same lands. It was a meeting of giants, not in size, but in will. On one side, the towering strength of mammoths and mastodons. On the other, the patience, tools, and teamwork of humans. It would be a relationship of awe, danger, and survival. To the first humans, elephants were more than animals. They were food, fuel, and survival itself. A single mammoth could feed a tribe for weeks. Its bones could be used for tools, its hide for shelter, its fat for warmth in freezing winters. But to bring one down, that was no small task. It took courage, planning, and unity. Spears had to strike in the right place. Fires had to drive the herd. And even then, many hunters did not return. For humans, the hunt for elephants was one of the greatest risks. And for elephants, humans became a danger unlike any predator they had ever known. But humans did not only hunt elephants, they also revered them. In caves across Europe, mammoths were carved and painted on walls, their shapes traced in ochre and charcoal. These were not just drawings of prey, they were symbols of power, endurance, and life itself. To carve an elephant into stone was to honor it, to remember it, to give thanks. Even as humans hunted them, they respected them as spirits of the earth. The first whispers of myth and legend were born here, beside firelight and stone. In some places, humans and elephants lived side by side for generations. In Siberia and Ukraine, huts made of mammoth bones still stand, shelters built from the remains of giants. In Africa, herds of ancient elephants thundered across the savannas, while small human tribes followed them, learning the rhythms of water and grass. To walk with elephants was to learn the land itself. They knew where rivers flowed. They knew where the rains would fall. They shaped the environment, and humans learned to follow their trails. It was not always war. Sometimes it was guidance. But as humans grew smarter, the balance shifted. We learned to use traps, fire, and strategy. Entire herds could be driven into pits, into swamps, or off cliffs. It was efficient. It was brutal. And it worked. The very intelligence that allowed humans to survive now turned against the giants who had ruled for millions of years. For the first time, elephants faced not nature, but the rise of human ingenuity. Even as we hunted them, humans wove elephants into their earliest myths. Ivory was carved into tiny statues, symbols of fertility and life. Shamans danced with tusks, invoking the spirit of the mammoth. For some tribes, the bones of elephants were sacred, gifts from the earth, not just the remains of an animal. In story and ritual, the giants lived on, shaping not only our survival, but our imagination. For thousands of years, humans and elephants coexisted in this fragile dance, sometimes enemies, sometimes partners in the cycle of the land. But the world was changing. The ice was melting, forests were shifting, and humans were spreading faster than ever. The age-old balance between giant and hunter
was beginning to tip. Slowly, the mammoths grew fewer. The mastodons retreated. And though humans may not have known it then, their actions, combined with a warming earth, were pushing the first giants toward their end. This was the beginning of a long story, a story where humans and elephants would always be bound together, not just as hunter and prey, but as rivals, teachers, and eventually, companions. The first meeting had passed, and from it, the fate of both would be forever changed.
The Ice Age was never meant to last forever. Around 12,000 years ago, the Earth began to warm. The glaciers that had stretched for miles began to retreat. Forests spread into open plains. The mammoth steppe, the greatest grassland the world had ever known, started to vanish. For millions of years, mammoths and mastodons had thrived in the cold. But now, the world was changing, and not every giant could change with it. The grasslands grew smaller each year. Food became scarce. Herds that once numbered in the thousands now dwindled. Calves starved. Families broke apart. And as their world shrank, another predator spread across it, one armed not with claws or fangs, but with fire and stone, and soon with weapons of bone and flint. The humans. Humans had learned how to hunt the giants with deadly precision. They built traps. They used fire to drive herds into bogs. They struck in coordinated groups, spears flashing in the snow. The mammoths were strong, but humans were clever, and cleverness began to win. In North America, the mastodons faced the same fate. One by one, the herds disappeared, victims of a new kind of predator they had never faced before. Not all mammoths vanished at once. On Wrangel Island, off the coast of Siberia, a tiny group of woolly mammoths survived long after their cousins were gone. For thousands of years, they lived in isolation, cut off from the mainland. But even here, fate was cruel. Their numbers dwindled to only a few hundred. Inbreeding weakened them. Fresh water grew scarce. And then, silence. Around 4,000 years ago, when the pyramids of Egypt were already standing, the last mammoth fell. They were gone, and just like that, the age of mammoths ended. The mastodons, too, were gone, leaving only bones buried in ice and earth. For the first time in millions of years, the northern world was without its giants. The great trumpets of mammoth herds were silent. The forests grew still, and humanity, perhaps unknowingly, had played its part in closing one of nature's grandest chapters. But though their bodies were gone, mammoths lived on in memory. For indigenous peoples, they became spirits of the underworld, bones rising from the earth like guardians of the past. To the Yakut of Siberia, mammoth tusks were the ivory of great beasts still alive deep underground. To others, they were dragons, frozen in the ice, waiting to awaken. Even in absence, the giants haunted human imagination. Today, we still uncover them. Perfectly preserved mammoths lie locked in ice, their hair, skin, even stomachs intact. Their tusks are treasures, their bones storytellers, their DNA a whisper from a vanished world. It is as if the giants never fully left us, as if the earth itself remembered them. And yet not all of their kind were gone. Far to the south, in the warmth of Africa and Asia, the last true elephants survived. They had endured the changes, adapted to new lands, and carried forward the legacy of their ancient kin. The age of mammoths and mastodons was over, but the story of elephants was only just beginning.
When the mammoths and mastodons vanished, the earth was left quieter. But in Africa and Asia, their cousins endured.
Smaller, smoother skinned, with curved tusks and wise eyes, these elephants stepped into a new age. The Ice Age had ended. Now, the age of civilizations was beginning. And in the valleys of great rivers, the Nile, the Tigris, the Indus, humans and elephants would meet. In Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, elephants once roamed freely. Carvings from ancient Sumer show their likeness, proof that these giants were known to the first cities. But here, elephants were rare, almost exotic. They lived on the edges of empires, in the forests of Syria and beyond. For the Mesopotamians, they were symbols of distant lands, of power and wealth, reserved for kings who sought to show dominion over nature itself. Farther east, in the Indus Valley, elephants were not distant. They lived side by side with people. On carved seals, elephants appear as sacred symbols, marked with reverence. Some believe they were even tamed here. Among the first places where humans and elephants walked together, not as hunter and hunted, but as companions. It was a relationship of respect, an understanding that these animals carried strength, wisdom, and a presence that felt almost divine. In Egypt, elephants were rarer, still. They once roamed the Nile Valley, but the deserts pressed in and their numbers dwindled. Yet Egyptian kings sought them out. They saw in elephants a symbol of foreign lands, of conquest and tribute. In temples and records, ivory became a treasure, the white gold of the ancient world. The tusks of elephants, traded from far-off Nubia and beyond, filled Egyptian halls with carvings and sacred objects. Ivory was more than decoration. It was power, wealth, and prestige. From Mesopotamia to Egypt, kings hoarded it. Traders carried it across deserts and seas, and behind every carved statue, every inlaid throne, was the life of a giant taken from the forests. For elephants, this was the beginning of a long history where their lives and their tusks became currency in human empires. But elephants were not only resources, they were symbols. In the Indus Valley, they may have represented rain, fertility, and abundance. To Mesopotamians, they were guardians of distant lands, and in Egypt, their ivory became tied to the sacred, objects placed in tombs to guide kings into the afterlife. Already, elephants had become larger than life, not just animals, but myth. In these early days, elephants were rarely tamed. They were wild, dangerous, respected from a distance. But the stage was being set. Soon, human ambition would no longer be satisfied with ivory alone. Kings would want elephants themselves, alive, trained, and turned into living weapons of war. That revolution was yet to come. But already, the bond between human civilization and elephants had been forged. From mammoth steppes to river valleys, elephants had crossed into legend. In Mesopotamia, the Indus, and Egypt, they were treasures, symbols, and sacred beings. Their tusks shaped art, their presence shaped myth. The Ice Age giants were gone, but elephants had entered the human story. And soon, they would change the fate of empires.
Before elephants marched with kings or carried warriors into battle, they lived in the imagination of humankind. To see an elephant in the ancient world was to glimpse a living wonder, a creature so vast, so powerful, and yet so strangely gentle that people everywhere gave them meaning beyond flesh and bone. They became symbols of strength, of wisdom, of memory, and of mystery. Across Africa, elephants were woven into folklore. For some peoples, they were thought of as the guardians of water, guiding rains and protecting rivers. Others saw in them the spirits of ancestors, their long lives a sign of wisdom carried through generations. In West Africa, folktales tell of elephant kings, wise rulers of the forest, balancing power with compassion. To kill such a giant was not only dangerous, it was taboo, an act that could bring misfortune upon a whole village. Ivory was not only wealth, in many cultures it carried a sacred power. Its pale color symbolized purity, moonlight, or even the bones of gods. Objects carved from ivory were placed in temples, used in rituals, and given as offerings. But behind the sacred lay a contradiction. Each ivory relic meant the death of an elephant. Even in myth, their loss echoed through human history. In Mesopotamia, elephants were rare and wondrous. Their images carved into seals or placed in temples marked them as symbols of distant lands, of divine strength. To the kings of the Tigris and Euphrates, the elephant was proof of their reach, that their power stretched far beyond the rivers, into forests where giants still walked. Though elephants lived on the edges of these empires, their presence in art reveals how deeply they impressed the human mind. In Egypt, elephants became part of a spiritual economy. Their tusks, traded from Nubia and beyond, were turned into sacred objects. Carved amulets, ritual tools, and offerings were placed in tombs as if the essence of the elephant could guide kings into the afterlife. Though elephants themselves grew scarce in the Nile Valley, their ivory remained. To Egyptians, it carried a piece of the divine, linking the living world with the eternal. Many ancient tales describe elephants as creatures of memory. They lived long lives, remembered paths through forests, and cared for their families with devotion. Humans saw in this a mirror of their own hopes, to endure, to remember, to protect. And so elephants became more than animals. They were teachers of patience, symbols of loyalty, and guardians of the past. For peoples who lived far from elephants, they became legends. Travelers spoke of beasts with trees for legs and rivers for trunks. In lands that never saw them, the idea of the elephant was larger than life, a creature that belonged half to this world and half to myth. Across Africa, Mesopotamia, and Egypt, elephants became spirits, symbols, and sacred treasures. But human ambition never stayed still. Where once ivory and myth were enough, kings now hungered for more. They wanted not just the tusks, but the living giants themselves. Elephants, the guardians of forest and spirit, would soon be dragged into the dust of battlefields. The age of elephant wars was about to begin.
For thousands of years, elephants lived only as symbols in myth, untamed giants of the forest. But as civilizations grew bolder, a new idea emerged. What if the strength of the elephant could serve the strength of kings? The process was not easy. Capturing a wild elephant meant facing a creature that weighed 5 tons and could crush a man with a single step. But humans persisted. They built wooden stockades. They dug pits. They used trained elephants to calm the captured ones. Slowly, painfully, elephants became part of human society. And once the first kings saw what an elephant could do on the battlefield, they would never look back. The first great empire to harness elephants for war was Persia. By the 5th century BCE, the Achaemenid kings fielded elephants as living tanks. Persian generals saw them as more than beasts. They were banners of power, thunder that shook the ground before an army even clashed. When Alexander the Great invaded Persia, he faced these towering opponents. His soldiers, trained to fight men, now had to stand against walls of flesh, ivory, and rage. For the first time, the West realized the terror of war elephants. But if Persia introduced elephants to war, it was India that perfected them. By the time of the Maurya Empire, elephant corps numbered in the thousands. They were not just soldiers, they were living fortresses, carrying archers, lancers, even commanders on their backs. Indian kings bred elephants with care, trained them with precision, and used them to form the backbone of their armies. To see a line of elephants march forward was to watch a wall of mountains advancing across the battlefield. In India, the elephant was not only a beast of burden, it was a symbol of empire itself. In 326 BCE, at the Battle of Hydaspes, Alexander the Great crossed into India and met elephants face to face. King Porus fielded a mighty elephant corps. Macedonian soldiers, veterans of years of conquest, now had to stand against walls of flesh, ivory, and rage. For the first time, the West realized the terror of war elephants. Yet Alexander adapted. His cavalry attacked the elephants' flanks. His archers targeted the mammoths, the riders who guided them. Slowly, painfully, elephants became part of human society. Alexander won the battle, but he never forgot the lesson. An elephant was both the greatest weapon and the greatest risk a commander could unleash. 2 centuries later, another general would gamble everything on the power of elephants. Hannibal of Carthage led his army and his war elephants across the Alps to invade Rome itself. Through icy passes, across impossible terrain, the elephants marched, symbols of Carthaginian defiance. Few survived the journey, but the ones that did struck terror into Roman hearts. When Hannibal's elephants charged onto Italian soil, they carried with them the legend of impossible ambition. Rome would adapt, Rome would endure, but Hannibal's march became one of the most iconic feats in military history, and the elephants were its living heart. The Romans, disciplined and unyielding, soon learned to counter elephants. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, Scipio Africanus faced Hannibal one last time. When Carthage unleashed its elephants, the Romans did not panic. They opened their ranks, creating lanes for the beasts to charge through harmlessly. Once inside, the elephants were cut down, leaving Hannibal's army broken. It was the beginning of the end for war elephants in the Mediterranean. Rome had found a way to neutralize the terror. Even as Rome rejected them, elephants continued to dominate warfare in the East. In Southeast Asia, from Burma to Cambodia, elephants remained the kings of battle. They carried generals, broke enemy lines, and served as living towers. In Africa, kingdoms experimented with their own elephants, though they proved harder to tame. Everywhere they appeared, they carried the same meaning: power, wealth, majesty. They were not just weapons, they were empires made flesh. The age of war elephants stretched for centuries. From the deserts of Persia to the jungles of India to the snowy peaks of the Alps, they shaped battles and bent empires. But even in their glory, they were fragile allies, difficult to train, costly to feed, dangerous to control, a gift of unmatched power and unpredictable fury. In the centuries to come, the world would change. New weapons would rise, and the elephants, once kings of the battlefield, would slowly march toward a different role in human history. The era of war elephants was not the end. It was only one chapter in their long and complicated bond with mankind.
The age of war elephants reached its peak with empires stretching from India to Africa. But as centuries turned, a new invention shook the foundations of battle: gunpowder. Cannons roared louder than any trumpet of a charging elephant. Muskets spat fire and smoke, cutting through armor and hide alike. For the first time in history, the giants who once inspired fear were themselves thrown into chaos. Gunpowder did more than kill. It terrified.
The sharp crack of rifles, the thunder of cannonballs, the choking clouds of smoke, all combined to confuse and panic the very animals that armies once depended on. The battlefield had changed, and the elephants, no matter how mighty, could not change with it. Elephants had always been dangerous weapons, but also dangerous liabilities. In moments of panic, they did not always run toward the enemy. Sometimes they turned back, crashing into their own soldiers, trampling allies beneath their massive feet. Generals realized a terrible truth. The larger the elephant, the greater the risk. The same beasts that once turned battles into victories could also turn victories into disaster. Gunpowder exposed this weakness like never before. With every new weapon came louder blasts, hotter flames, and more confusion. Slowly, commanders across Asia began to ask a question once unthinkable. Were elephants still worth it? Even as their usefulness waned, some armies clung to tradition. In the dense jungles of Southeast Asia, in kingdoms like Burma, Siam, and Cambodia, elephants still marched into battle. They carried kings upon gilded towers. They shattered wooden defenses. They trampled soldiers beneath their tusks. But each century, their role grew smaller. By the 1700s, the thunder of cannons drowned out the rumble of elephants' feet. By the 1800s, in the age of European empires, elephants were no longer terrors of war, but targets. The end of an era had arrived. When colonial powers swept through Asia and Africa, they brought more than armies. They brought industrial warfare. Against rifles, elephants were helpless. Against cannons, they were slaughtered. No armor, no training, no courage could withstand the modern battlefield. And so the elephant's role shifted. No longer were they weapons of war. Instead, they became beasts of burden. They hauled cannons instead of facing them. They carried supplies instead of kings. From warriors to workers, their transformation was complete. Though their time as warriors was ending, elephants never left the stage of human imagination. In kingdoms and courts, they still marched proudly in ceremonies. Draped in jewels, painted in brilliant colors, they carried kings not into war, but into celebration. Their presence was no longer practical, it was symbolic. They stood as living monuments to the past, reminders of power, majesty, and divine connection. Whereas once they carried soldiers into chaos, now they carried traditions into memory. By the late 19th century, war elephants had all but disappeared. No grand battles, no thundering charges, no armies relying on them to decide victory or defeat. Instead, they slipped quietly out of history. They returned to the forests, to the grasslands, to the rivers. The age of war elephants had lasted for more than 2,000 years, but in the end, it ended not with a roar, but with silence. The story of war elephants is not just about battles. It is about humanity's relationship with nature. We once saw elephants as gods. Then we made them soldiers. And when the world changed, we let them go. But their image, the armored giant, the charging beast, the living fortress, remains carved in stone, painted on temple walls, remembered in legends. Even when history moved on, memory did not. The war elephant may be gone, but it will never be forgotten. From gods to warriors, from kings to workers, elephants walked with us through millennia of history. They fought beside us, died beside us, and lived in our stories long after their battles were done. The battlefield no longer belongs to them, but the memory does. And perhaps in that memory, the giants still march.
War elephants once thundered across plains, shaking the ground with their massive steps. But when gunpowder, cannons, and modern armies ended their role in battle, elephants did not vanish from human imagination. Instead, they shifted into something deeper. They became symbols, stories, legends carried through generations. From Africa to Asia, from the courts of kings to the tales told by firelight, the elephant was no longer just a creature of power, it was a creature of meaning. They lived not only in the forests, but in the cultural memory of humankind. Across Africa, elephants have always been teachers. In folklore, they are wise elders who remember everything, guiding other animals through droughts and across rivers. Some stories describe them as kings of the animal kingdom, not through fear, but through patience and memory. The San people of southern Africa spoke of elephants as sacred beings, linked to the rain and fertility of the land. To harm one was to disrupt the balance of nature. Even today, in African proverbs, an elephant often represents wisdom, strength, and community. The elephant does not forget. The elephant walks slowly, but it never falls. These sayings kept the spirit of the giant alive long after spears and shields gave way to rifles and cities. In Southeast Asia, the elephant became a creature of royalty. Long after wars faded, white elephants in Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand symbolized divine kingship. To possess a white elephant was not simply to own a beast, it was to hold a sign of cosmic approval. In stories, elephants carried gods, lifted mountains, and guarded palaces. They were painted into murals, carved into temples, sung into lullabies. For the people of these lands, elephants were more than animals. They were threads woven into the very fabric of culture and destiny. In India, elephants moved from the battlefield into pageantry, courts, and storytelling. They became symbols of royalty, painted in miniature art, written into poetry, and remembered in chronicles of kings. Palaces kept them not as weapons, but as companions of honor, grand beasts that walked beside rulers during festivals and processions. Even in folk tales told to children, elephants were protectors, clever friends, or sometimes mischievous giants, teaching lessons through their size and gentleness. Here, the elephant was not just a relic of history, it was a living presence, a reminder of the grandeur of the past and a companion of culture. Even in lands where elephants no longer roamed, memory lingered. In the Middle East, stories of war elephants lived on in chronicles of empires and battles. Poets described them as moving fortresses, creatures too large to be forgotten. In ancient Rome and Carthage, elephants became symbols of power in mosaics and statues, remembered not only as beasts of war, but as exotic wonders. Though they disappeared from battlefields centuries earlier, their image still carried awe, the echo of thunderous steps across the sand. Through trade and storytelling, the elephant's memory traveled far. In Europe, where living elephants were rarely seen, they became almost mythical. Medieval bestiaries described them as creatures of loyalty and chastity, protectors of purity and symbols of wisdom. In China, elephants were painted in scrolls as bringers of peace and prosperity, associated with strength tempered by gentleness. The elephant crossed oceans, not by walking, but by living in stories, reshaped, retold, and reimagined until it was no longer just an animal, but a global legend. Over time, the elephant became a metaphor. Its size meant power, its memory meant wisdom, its strength meant resilience. To call something the elephant in the room meant it was too large to ignore. To say, an elephant never forgets, meant memory was as lasting as stone. Every culture, every language that remembered elephants carried with it a piece of this meaning. The living giants may have left the battlefield, but in our minds, they marched on, becoming part of how humans understood strength, patience, and time itself. From African savannas to Asian temples, from desert chronicles to European manuscripts, the elephant has lived two lives. One in the forests and plains, where its herds still move in silence, the other in our stories, where its spirit still walks beside us. No canon, no empire, no change in time could erase it. Because the elephant is not only an animal, it is memory itself. And memory never dies.
thank you for walking this path with Dreamwoven History, where stories never fade and memories live forever. May your night be peaceful, your dreams full of wonder, and may history whisper to you until the morning light.